Hello.
Our adventure continues a year into training on a discreet rebel outpost in the Outer Rim. This outpost was really remote, similar to the one on Hoth, but even more so. The Messina System was barren from just about any other database, and aside from the 13th sister coming here close to 12 years beforehand, there wasn't much worry of the Empire coming here, especially because Luna's ship was jettisoned into space. Regardless, Luke and Titus were now fulfilling the role of master and apprentice. Titus felt a large amount of pressure to continue his training, but he was going to do it for Luke. It was a bit stressful too. Training a Skywalker was never easy work, though with Han, Leia, and Chewie and a number of Alliance heroes here, it was easier for Luke to stay put during his training. Titus realized one fundamental trouble with Luke. He was a natural hero. He fit right into that role without much issue, which was a bit surprising for a moisture farmer from the planet of Tatooine. But the problem with being a natural hero was that it wasn't what a Jedi was. Sure, Anakin Skywalker was a hero, but he was a hero of a war, and the Jedi were not warmongers. Titus knew this and he needed to instruct it. He studied his entire life and still got aspects of the code wrong, but that was the essence of being a Jedi. There were flaws, being that no Jedi could be perfect, they could only strive for it. Titus knew that he needed to be more than he was for Katooni, Luna, or Ezra. He had to reach for a level far greater than that of just an instructor. He had to be a teacher for the one hope in the galaxy. Titus had the same realization that Obi-Wan Kenobi had. The one meant to restore the balance wasn't themselves, rather it was Luke. The fate of the galaxy sat in his hands. Obi-Wan realized this after his first confrontation with a metallic husk called Darth Vader. Titus realized this upon returning to the Messina System and having all the memories of Katooni and Luna show up. His greatest failures pushed him away from the Jedi, and his greatest triumph would be in the restoration of the Jedi. Over the course of the last year, Luke had a lot of basic instruction, stuff that younglings learn before they reach the age of 10, the only difficulty being that on these missions on behalf of the Alliance, sometimes Han, Leia, and Chewie would request that Luke come along, and in his adolescent naivety, he would go along, searching for the same adventure that beset his father, an incurable quest for the next greatest adventure. Titus would let Luke go on these missions with his friends, remaining here and spending time in the ruins of what the Jedi had left behind at the massive stone structure. The structure in the field and the temple in Mount Etna were the main places that Titus stayed at. They had the Force within them, and he was able to concentrate on his mission statement there. Titus had been looking for communication from Grandmaster Yoda for a number of years, but he was unable to see the Grand Master. Ezra had the fortune of meeting Yoda through the Jedi Temple in Athol, but Titus never had that luxury. He was in a bind. During these days that Luke was gone, Titus often questioned his worthiness as a teacher, though he was always empowered when he got to talk to General Syndulla. While the Ghost Squad was split up a bit, notably Sabine on the Thal and Zeb bouncing around the Outer Rim, Hera and her son Jason were operating out of this hidden base here on Earth. While Hera was, well, Hera, she did obey orders, and Mon Mothma had ordered her to stay out of active combat for a little bit of time. Hera and Titus were always closest friends, and they continued their great friendship here. She saw a lot of Kanan and Titus, especially because Kanan often doubted himself as a teacher when it came to Ezra. Though she understood that for someone as powerful as Skywalker, it was a bit tantalizing. She still understood that because Ezra had quite an accelerated growth in the Force, especially due to his tampering with the Sith holocron. Luke's was a bit more manageable in that sense, but there was still a darkness that resided within him, especially because shortly after Yavin, Luke came into contact with Vader, still without realizing that his father was inside of the suit. When Luke returned, Titus got back to work on training the boy. Titus was able to walk Luke through formal training of a lightsaber, which included forms and techniques. Luke otherwise wouldn't have learned these forms with as much precision. Titus started every day off similarly to how he had for the last 10 years. A meditation was great, an easy way for him to focus on the living force around him, to calm his mind and to calm his heart before the beginning of a very long day. Every day had a new challenge. Many of them were challenges that couldn't be prepared for, and Luke learned this lesson with Titus time and time again. Sometimes would be as basic as lightsaber training, other times would be as tough as a long Jedi hike through one of the planet's various mountain ranges. R2-D2 would get involved in training from time to time, but for the most part he stayed with Leia. Lightsaber training for Luke could go a number of different ways. The first one was with a Jedi training droid, held since the fall of the Republic. Other times would be training with Titus himself. Luke's biggest weakness was his constant need to achieve victory in the shortest amount of time. It was easy for Luke to get away with this. He was incredibly powerful. Because of his power, he could sweep an opponent in combat quickly. This was not something shared amongst most Force users, and Titus could tell that his apprentice that it was not something that would work against Vader. As far as Titus was aware at this point, the Inquisitorius had died out, probably on Malachor, though it was really unknown at this point. During one of their training sessions, Titus saw the darkness within Luke for the first time. It wasn't exactly the first time, but it startled him. Luke was frustrated, and by using his frustration, he whipped his lightsaber violently through a number of trees, destroying them and killing a couple of animals. Titus didn't react in a negative way. He simply looked at Luke and waited for him to say something. Especially because Titus knew Luke was wise enough to distinguish the difference between right and wrong. Almost immediately afterwards, he admitted his regret for having done so. Titus let Luke talk out his feelings on the matter, and he expressed a terrible shame. Titus looked over at the trees and told Luke that the dark side could do that. It could remove his control and cause pain to those around them. Those trees would never grow again, and those creatures would never walk again. But in their absence, growth would continue. As is a cycle with everything, scars will fade, some will see them as wounds, and incurable reminders, while others will see them as growth. For Luke, he too should see them as growth. That mistake, while painful, could not be reversed. Luke understood what his master taught him, and yet he still had much to learn. These lessons for Luke would carry on, and while Titus always allowed Luke to make his own decisions and have his own free will, he was always disappointed. Whenever an opportunity to leave Earth came, Luke took it. He chased the adventure, and it left Titus looking for a new way to communicate to Skywalker, the true path of the Jedi. While Luke was away, gallivanting across the galaxy, Titus returned to his roots, going back to the Jedi Temple instead of Mount Etna. When he got there, he focused on the Force and called out, searching for any surviving Jedi Masters that were out in the galaxy. Of course, his main thoughts resided on the former Grand Master of the Jedi Order, the one who spoke to the Jedi Lothal years ago. Surely Yoda would know how to do this. Luke wasn't like Katooni, Luna, Ezra, or Kanan. He was a combination of all their attributes, which wasn't necessarily bad. However, it was challenging for him to teach. It was the same feat that the young, inexperienced Obi-Wan Kenobi had to go through with young Anakin Skywalker. Titus knew he could do this, but the main issue was quelling Luke's lust for adventure. Titus would talk to Rex and Hera about it, being that both of them were currently on-world, Hera reminding him of how Ezra was when they first brought him into the crew. He was reckless and insubordinate, but it was because he spent his entire life on his own. Luke wasn't much different, but instead of being on his own, he was restricted to Tatooine. Titus had two realistic choices: show him that adventure wasn't the Jedi way, or simply allow him to continue in hope that he would after all retain all the information he was presented. Rex's opinion was similar in a way, but it revolved more around what he observed from Anakin and Ahsoka's relationship during the Clone Wars. Considering it was father and son, Anakin and Luke, surely it meant that there could be some correlation between the two of them. Rex mentioned that Anakin used to show Ahsoka the consequences of those actions, though the main difference was that the Clone Wars were multiple active battle fronts, whereas this galactic civil war was a small-scale warfare. The rebellion was tiny and the Empire was massive, so it's not like Luke could really learn more about the Jedi way from being on the front lines. Titus decided he would take on Hera's advice, and he would meditate on it inside of the Etna Temple. While Titus was present for most of the time that Ezra was being trained, he wasn't as hands-on because he believed that it was Kanan's responsibility to train the boy. Now that responsibility fell into his lap. When Titus returned to the Etna Temple, he calmed his mind, removing the stress and anxieties that fell deep into him, and he fell into a deep meditation. Instead of the meditation, he heard a voice of an older man call out to him. He was unsure of who it was, but when Titus opened his eyes, he saw a blue shadow. He asked who it was, and he saw the older face of someone who looked so familiar. When the voice called out to Titus again, he realized it was Obi-Wan Kenobi. Titus asked the Jedi Master what it was that he should do, and Kenobi told Titus that his journey as a teacher would be fulfilled, but first he must bring Skywalker to the planet of Dagobah. On the planet, he had an extended training that could be done with Grandmaster Yoda. Titus accepted his next step in his journey. When he woke up, it was an entirely different time of day. It was actually nighttime. When Luke was on his adventures, Titus spent a lot of time on his own, learning more about the planet. He learned a lot about the planet where he was born. The location of which he lost Katooni, Luna, and Lugnut was referred to by the locals as Stonehenge. The ancient Jedi had created the structure for the purpose of communication. Titus had learned about the people across the planet, extraditing Force sensitives, and even in terrible scenarios, executing them. He found this through some of their ancient art, and so forth. Of course, nowadays he hadn't picked up or seen any other Force users about in the various cultures around the world. Regardless, Stonehenge was placed by the Jedi before they left. When the Jedi originally came here thousands of years before, the ancient societies welcomed them and their kind. Stonehenge was something that could only be activated by a Force user or individual, and it seemed that through the years of conquest and fighting with other tribes, it was lost. Or of course, there was a possible scenario where the leader's heir had no Force sensitivity to the Force, and so the religion died with the leader. The Jedi had intended on returning to Stonehenge and Earth over the years to bring people to their order, and it was just seemingly forgotten to time, aside from the few members who accidentally found themselves on this planet. Where Titus was at Mount Etna, he learned that this temple was more so a database of relics. There were ancient texts and hieroglyphics. Titus wished that Katuni could have been here for it. She was very interested in it, and she couldn't wait till Titus figured out what was being said by the ancient Jedi. Titus learned that the Jedi came here and all the documents were left so the ancient people of Sicily could assist in building a Jedi Order of sorts. It was a broken down version of the Jedi Code, but it was understood in the dialect of the locals, which is why Titus couldn't figure it out for so long. He spent years trying to translate it to Galactic Common when it was never in that. Mount Etna was one example of this. There were several other locations around the globe where these existed. The text taught people how to learn the Force in the confines of the Jedi Code, though it was lost to time. Titus also learned about what the Separatists did, and it haunted him. The history on the subject was vague, but what he was able to learn is that the people weren't quite complacent. Some of them became strong slaves for the Zagarians and other criminal empires, but of course there were those who weren't, which was most of them. Those people were executed mercilessly. When the Separatists fell, and over the years the criminal empire after criminal empire fell, collapsing, the people were freed. Not a lot, but a good number of them, and they began to intermingle in the galaxy. Titus got up and walked back to his ship and returned to the rebel base. When he got there, the Millennium Falcon had returned. Luke was with his friends, and they were talking about their great adventure. Titus went over to Hera and kindly asked her if he could borrow the Phantom for a little while. She nodded her head and told him to be safe on his new endeavor. Titus got Luke and told him they were going to visit a Jedi Grand Master. With the Jedi Master, they would continue his training on an isolated location. At first, Luke took this the same way Ezra took Kanan, trying to get Master Luminara unduly to teach him. That was far from the case. Once they were in the Phantom with R2-2, they took off and jumped to lightspeed towards Dagobah. Inside the ship, Luke asked Titus if he was trying to get rid of him, to which Titus shook his head. Titus explained that he was taking Luke to the Grand Master of the Jedi Order, someone who survived the Purge and had lived for 900 years. Luke looked at him almost astonished. He never heard of a species living for so long. Titus continued saying that Yoda was the wisest of all the Jedi. He would be able to better communicate things that Titus struggled to communicate. Titus continued telling Luke that the Jedi were flawed, and that meant that Titus was too. He wouldn't always have the best way of explaining things, and Yoda might. He taught thousands of Jedi in his time. He made it a point to teach as many classes whenever he could. Once Yoda was Grand Master, he trained every group of students until the rise of the Empire. Not a single student didn't get trained by Grand Master Yoda at some point. When they arrived, they slowly drifted down into the swamplands of the planet. Using the Phantom, they were able to find a clear area to land without crashing down into a swamp. When the doors opened, they were a little taken aback, especially Titus. He knew Yoda. He was at one point trained by the Grand Master. He couldn't imagine Yoda being on a planet like this. Regardless, they set up camp for the night and began having a conversation. Luke talked about his eagerness to get back out on the adventure, to join his friends and take down the Empire. Titus told Luke that he respected where his heart was, but that wasn't necessarily the path of the Jedi. Luke still didn't quite get it. The Jedi were mythologized, placed at a legendary standard. The last time the Jedi were seen in the galactic realm, they were warriors, not peacekeepers. This romanticization of the Jedi had people believing they were superheroes, but they weren't. Luke didn't understand, so Titus began a history lesson. He talked about the High Republic a number of times, but the Jedi from the era of the High Republic were much more than just warriors. They embodied the way of the Jedi. There was still a tightness with the Republic to a degree, but that fallacy of the Jedi, at the end of the day, was their rush into action, their negligence to hold together the balance. In hindsight, it's easy to say that. In the moment, it's hard to accept it, suggesting that Luke listened to the mistakes of the past. There are very few Jedi left in the galaxy with the possibility of Ezra being alive. It made maybe 6 or 7 Jedi that could still be alive aside from Luke and Titus. They were the last of their kind. If they did not stand up to the darkness, then their religion would be lost to the texts of history. Luke continued to listen, but in his youthful energy, he didn't want to accept it. He wanted to chase the great adventure. When he said the word adventure, a little creature popped out, sitting sitting on a tree overlooking them. Titus looked up and his jaw dropped. The Jedi Master, before speaking, was silenced by the little green life form. Luke turned around and looked at the small animal, asking what he was doing listening to their conversation. Luke, in reality, was being a bit hostile towards Yoda, and it was fair enough. He didn't trust the idea of random animals who spoke to them in the swamps. Yoda spoke in riddles. Titus knew this all too well, but he couldn't just tell Luke. There was something that Yoda was trying to understand about young Skywalker, and he didn't want to get in the way of the Grand Master's plan. The plan being that he would get Luke to come back to his home and see if Skywalker would have the patience of a Jedi. Yoda up to this point was very aware that Luke had been training in the Jedi arts for a full year under Titus. This was less of a test for Titus as it was for Luke. Titus was a survivor. Luke was a future. There was a significant difference in the behavior for the both of them in Yoda's eyes. He knew he would be teaching Skywalker, but when he got a hold of him, he realized how much like his father he really was. He had this incredible power, especially after learning about the Force for a full year, but he had the same demeanor as Anakin did. It just flowed through their family. The power in the Force came with a certain attitude. Yoda told Ben that he couldn't train the boy, to which Luke finally realized that it was Yoda. He understood why Titus didn't come along, though again feeling that little bit of resentment for his teacher, feeling like Titus was trying to get rid of him again. Titus came around the corner after Yoda expressed that he would reluctantly train Luke. Titus told Luke that he would be here with him every step of the way, through every journey that he took with the Grand Master. Titus exclaimed that he too had much to learn, being as no master knew everything, no matter how old or wise. Yoda was thoroughly impressed to see how far Titus had come in his journey. After all, he stayed true to the roots of the Jedi, unlike his sister Luna. Yoda knew that because of the burden that sat on Titus's heart. He could tell that something happened to her, likely becoming one of the nasty Inquisitors. Yoda, having agreed to train Luke, would begin with a simple instruction to figure out how far along Luke was, to which he was pleasantly surprised that despite his quest for adventure, he was very far along in his training. Yoda approached this case with Skywalker as he would any other Jedi, not playing favorites. Their training would continue on for months. During this time, they would have limited communication with their friends in the rebellion. Once or twice a month, they would get a communication updating them with everything they needed to know. Yoda was able to get Luke to stay grounded. Without having visions of losing everyone he cared for, he wouldn't be compelled to rush off without finishing his training, though the lesson for Titus was when to put his foot down. His lenience with his sister, and even that with Katuni, was his problem. He just never realized it because Luna wasn't his responsibility as a teacher to teach as a Jedi Master, and Katuni wasn't going to be leaving his side on Messina, so there was no point. So when he got to someone like Luke and Ezra, he never knew how to put his foot down with them. He never had the lessons as a teacher that Kanan had with Ezra, being that he was on Yavin 4 during that period of time. There was one struggle for Luke though, because Dagobah was so intertwined with the Force, there was a cave where the visions of the future could incur. Inside of that cave, Luke consistently saw visions of himself inside of the suit of Darth Vader. It really bothered him, because he felt like he couldn't escape it, and it put a solidified fear into him about the dark side of the Force. Both Yoda and Titus encouraged Luke to not be afraid, being that fear is a path to the dark side of the Force. Luke trusted what his teachers told him. His time on Dagobah came to an end when he had a Force vision of a city in the clouds. He envisioned his friends running into a trap. For the past year, the Alliance relocated most of their assets to Echo Base on Hoth. The Empire found them. While Hera and a couple of other rebels bounced off of the Messina System, for the most part, the collective rebel force was inside of Echo Base at the time. The Empire found them and dropped several walkers, forcing them off the planet and into hiding. During their escape, a bounty hunter named Boba Fett was sent after the Millennium Falcon to track it down. Being that Vader was aware that Luke Skywalker was his son, was trying to find him. Considering Boba was just doing a bounty for Jabba the Hutt, he figured he might as well earn some extra credits from the Empire. Boba tracked the Falcon to Bespin, alerting the Empire to the direction of the rebel heroes. Luke on Dagobah was in a rush in his actions. Yoda and Ben warned Luke against doing it, but Titus was 50-50 on it. He was really on Luke's side, which meant he wasn't exactly the most Jedi either, but they were in danger. The real test wasn't that Luke wasn't prepared. He certainly was prepared to face Vader, but rushing off without finishing his training would negate him the necessary strength to be ready for Vader, or in his other words, stopping himself. Though there was one key thing that Luke was completely unaware of, that Vader was Anakin Skywalker. He was still under the belief that Vader killed Anakin Skywalker. The Phantom was ready to go and the two Jedi left, despite what Yoda told Luke to do. Titus went because he knew he couldn't stop Luke, so he should at least help. The Phantom lifted off the ground and into the air. Yoda closed his eyes, knowing what would happen, afraid of whether or not it would be a certain doom for the Jedi or if it would be the beginning of a new order. He stood silently as Ben talked to him, and slowly disappeared. On Bespin, the rebels were captured by Lord Vader and Boba Fett. It was a trap set up by Lando Calrissian, who was paid off by the Empire, but the deal got worse and worse, so Lando began to regret his decision, not really knowing how he could help or assist Han, Leia, and Chewie get out of anything. When Luke and Titus arrived, it was eerie. The dark side of the Force was very present. Luke and Titus at this point had individually faced Vader. They knew he was here, but where was he? They were unsure. Luke and Titus walked together with R2 trailing right behind them. The two of them bounced around corners in Cloud City, and it was usually more populated. Not that the two of them would know, but based on the very large size of the city, it was obviously apparent that there was a lockdown. Regardless, the two of them quickly crept through the hallways, keeping their eyes peeled around the corners. Both Titus and Luke stopped, standing at the opposite ends of each corner. Trusting the Force, the two of them could see a Mandalorian bounty hunter walking. Behind him was a case of carbonite and 2 stormtroopers. They peered around the corner, and the coast was clear. The two of them started forward, and R2 close behind them. They stopped at the edge of the hallway, and the sound of a blaster ripped through the hall, creating a massive echo as it planted down into the wall next to Luke. Titus jumped out of the hallway and looked forward. It was clear. Luke and Titus ran forward towards the bounty hunter. As they got there, they were redirected. Leia and Chewie could be seen by a number of Imperial troopers. On Chewie's back was the body of C-3PO. Luke and Titus began firing blasters in the directions of the stormtroopers, trying to avoid hitting their friends. Titus told Luke to go and get them. He would stop the bounty hunter. It was clear that Han was the individual frozen in carbonite. Luke nodded his head and ran forward, entering a chamber. When the light shot open, he heard a deep voice call out to him, telling him that the Force was with him. Luke turned his head and saw the masked man again. Vader was here, but this time Skywalker had confidence to fight the servant of the Emperor. In the hallways, Titus was catching up. He could hear the footsteps of the bounty hunter. Using a DL-18, he played cat and mouse with the Mandalorian bounty hunter. He knew of Boba Fett, and he was well aware that Boba was a clone of Jango. He could hear in the voice. The two of them blasted away at each other, leaving marks in the hallways. 2 stormtroopers were instructed to get Solo to Slave 1, without stopping. When Titus heard this, he ignited his lightsaber and leapt down the hallway. Boba saw this and raised his flamethrower, blasting fire in the direction of the Jedi Master. Titus flew his hand forward, using the Force to repel the fire from hitting him. Boba assumed he fried the Jedi, and then when the fire stopped, he realized he hadn't. Titus, using his momentum, threw Boba from his feet and whipped his lightsaber down the hallway. The lightsaber cut through 2 stormtroopers before finding itself in Titus's hands again. Boba grumbled. He was really hoping that this would be an easy mission, especially being that it didn't take much for him to get a hold of Han Solo to begin with. Boba got back to his feet as Titus tried to negotiate with him, telling the bounty hunter that if he let his friend go, then there would be no reason to fight. Boba told the Jedi that he had a bounty to catch. He was making his way through the universe like his father before him. He didn't really want to kill another Jedi, considering their religion was almost extinct. Titus didn't get upset by this or offended by this. He knew what Boba was trying to do, and he wasn't going to try and play that game. He worked with the clones, and he knew what they were capable of. He also knew what Boba was capable of. The two of them stared at each other. Just a little ways away from them, Luke and Vader were tangled up in a fight. Vader was going slightly easy on Luke, but he wasn't hiding his strength. Truthfully, Vader was impressed with the work that Luke was putting in. The kid was talented, and he was displaying his skills in front of his father. Vader, knowing that Luke was his son, wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to force him to join the dark side. Vader wanted to rule the galaxy as father and son, the same offer that he made to his wife more than 20 years beforehand. Vader almost got Luke caught in a trap, but it didn't work. Vader was surprised by Luke's impressive skill, though his eagerness to see how far his son had come along caught him in a bind when Luke kicked him off the carbon freezing chambers. Luke leapt down behind his father, but couldn't find him. Vader was using the darkness to his advantage. He was baiting Luke in, knowing that he could certainly overpower his son if he needed to. It was entirely possible that Vader was doubting him, just as he did Kenobi. Luke snuck through the chambers below the freezing chamber. He kept his eyes peeled, trusting the Force. As he crept forward, he could feel the darkness of Vader. He ignited his weapon, and before Vader could fully get around the corner for his surprise attack, he was clipped across the shoulder. This built a massive level of rage within Vader, swinging heavily at the young Jedi, but missing. Up above, Leia, Chewie, and Lando made their way for the landing platform that Boba was supposed to be on. When they got there, it was empty. The trio ran out to see if they could find Han. A couple hallways over, Boba shot his blaster rifle at Titus several times. The Jedi Master was fluid with his movements, blocking each strike and getting closer with each step. Boba was at a severe disadvantage. He couldn't utilize his jetpack in these hallways without slamming into something. He had to be as mobile as possible. But Boba knew how a Jedi worked. Most of them were way too peaceful to try and do something rambunctious, like Windu did to his father, of course. The two of them avoided blaster fire from each other. In reality, it was Boba avoiding being hit by his own shots. Titus slid across the floor. Boba got to his grapple and shot it forward. The lining wrapped Titus around the legs, but the Jedi was too quick and cut it off. Boba saw his opportunity and ran forward, blasting away. Titus narrowly avoided getting blasted in the head. He slid out of the way again and swung down, cutting Boba's blaster into pieces. The bounty hunter threw his fist forward, smacking into Titus' throat. The hit jarred him from his balance, and the bounty hunter got to work, kicking Titus off of his feet and preparing to put him into a headlock. The only thing that stopped him was Leia, when she shot a stun round into Boba's back. The bounty hunter tumbled to the ground. Titus began coughing really heavily, trying to regain his breath, as Leia and Chewie ran up to him to make sure he was alright. Chewie helped Titus up, and Leia gently patted him on the back. When Titus was able to gather his composure, he asked if they had seen Luke or not. They hadn't seen him since he was lured into a trap. Titus told the group of them to get Han to the Falcon. He would make sure that Luke was alright. He then looked down at R2 and requested that the astromech get to the Phantom and have it prepared for liftoff. The droid beeped at him and the group ran off. Titus turned back to where he came from and began to run. The lightsaber duel between father and son was tense. Luke had the advantage of adolescence. He was thin, vibrant, strong, and speedy. His father was none of these. Vader's strengths came from beating down on his opponents and breaking them down. This was Luke's greatest test, but he had also completed so much training in his time. Vader himself could see Luke fluctuate out of the light and into the dark, out of the dark and into the light. When Luke was in the light, he was manageable. When he was using the dark side, he became a true opponent. Luke used the dark side to beat his father back off his balance and control the fight. Vader was very surprised, but he had no time to admire his son's skills, because it could very easily be the death of him. Vader was pushed out into a walkway. He hadn't been in a full backpedal since the year he fought Kenobi. This kid was trained well by Obi-Wan, at least assuming that it was Kenobi who trained Luke to this level. Their blades clashed over and again. Luke wasn't breaking a sweat. His eyes were focused on every beat of the lightsaber. There wasn't a flicker of fear in his heart. Luke pressed forward, pushing once again, as Vader fell off of his feet, gripping onto the railing with his hand to keep himself up. Luke bashed down on Vader's lightsaber, beating his hand back and cutting down across Vader's shoulder, badly damaging the armor. Vader tumbled back to the ground, holding his lightsaber up, when the sound of a door opening behind them took Luke away from his attention to his father. Luke looked back and then forward as Titus tried to tell Luke it wasn't worth giving to the darkness to kill Vader. They were Jedi. Luke gripped and tightened his hand around the lightsaber. There was anger bellowing within him. Before Luke could react to Titus, Vader swung up and cut through his former lightsaber, taking the advantage away from Luke. Luke was very taken aback. He was so angry and upset. It was the only reminder he had of his father, and then he vocalized it. Vader heard the name Anakin come out of his son's mouth, and he tried to say something about Anakin, telling Luke that Obi-Wan never told him what happened to his father. Luke, without a second of calmness in his mind, used the Force to ignite Titus' lightsaber. Vader blocked a strike that came winding down from Skywalker. Luke yelled out, telling Vader that Obi-Wan told him enough. Vader moved backwards, holding his lightsaber above himself to protect himself from his son's rage. Titus tried to stop Luke, but the words came out of Vader's mouth, telling Luke that he was Luke's father. But it was one moment too late. Vader looked down and his hand was cut off, and in his chest was a lightsaber. Luke looked at Vader with terror in his eyes. Some of it was fear, some of it was anger, the rest was resentment. Vader's breathing shallowed out, and he withered away in front of the two Jedi, falling to the ground. Luke grabbed the lightsaber and ripped it around and held it to Titus' neck, demanding to know if it was true or not. Titus stepped back, seeing the fire in Skywalker's eyes. He could see that Luke, in reality, could just kill him and be done with it, though Titus had walked through the same fire before. The first time he encountered it was with his sister after she killed Katuni, and he looked at Luke with calmness, asserting himself as a Jedi Master that he was, telling Luke that there was no way for him to know. Luke stopped. The fire in his eyes slowly dissipated, and he turned back to look at his father. Luke raised his blade over his head and cut down, removing the entire section of the walkway that his dead father laid on. The walkway slipped and slid down to the bottom of the endless pit, eventually releasing the corpse of Vader out into the gas giant below. Luke turned around and looked at Titus. He stumbled over his words. Titus told Luke that if he knew, he would have told him. There was no reason for him to keep that information secret. Luke nodded his head, and he looked up at Titus. Before he could say a word, Titus opened his arms and embraced his student. He told Luke that he should never get upset about something that wasn't in his control. He should be proud of himself for the resilience he showed in that moment. Luke had a fire in his eyes, and if he let that get to him, it could have done something he would have regretted. When they broke out of their hug, Luke looked back over his shoulder and down at the chasm below. Titus put his hand on Luke's back and shoulder and told him that it was over. There was nothing that could be done or undo it. As the two of them walked back towards the Phantom, Luke asked Titus how he should live knowing that his father was the most evil man in the galaxy. The Jedi Master said that he had to accept that his father's actions weren't within his own control. There was only so much that Luke could control. His father and the creation of Darth Vader was not his burden to bear. Luke asked how they should go forward from here. Titus stopped and turned to his student. He told Luke that they should do as they wished. The Alliance was regrouping beyond the galactic rim. It was a very undisclosed location, very similar to the Messina System. Luke suggested they visit the Alliance fleet, and then from there go back to Earth to complete his training. Titus nodded his head, remembering that he should trust himself and his abilities. He could very easily be the one to help Luke finish his training, as long as he didn't doubt himself. Titus asked Luke if he would like to revisit the Jedi Masters on Dagobah. He stopped and thought. He told Titus that he trusted him with completing his training. The trust in him was something neither Yoda or Obi-Wan could have. They weren't bad teachers, for the most part, but Luke's issue was the lying about Vader. How many other lies had been told to him by the remaining council members? It was the same predicament his father had more than 20 years beforehand too. Luke also admitted that after threatening to kill Titus, he felt secure with him. It was because Titus didn't react negatively. He didn't get angry, he just let Luke realize that he made a mistake. No matter how wise or great someone was, they could always make mistakes, but mistakes are just that, mistakes. When the two Jedi returned to the Alliance fleet, it was revealed that a new era would begin, one without the Emperor's evil henchmen. Vader was gone, and while it was long before Luke could ever realize there was good within his father, it would send ripples to the other side of the galaxy. Inside of his temple on Coruscant, the Emperor arose, feeling this seething anger residing within the son of Anakin Skywalker. Palpatine didn't care that Vader died. He cared how he could manipulate the next of kin. Besides the fact that Palpatine's cloning facilities on Exegol were nearing completion, how could he not look forward to a new apprentice and the ability to reconstruct himself a newer body for essence transfer? Our story continues at the Rebel stronghold on Earth within the elusive Messina System. The Rebel base that had been here for years was completed and turned into the highest functioning secret base the Alliance had. This secret base wasn't just for the Alliance, but for the Jedi. It had been 4 years since Titus met Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewie, and they were all very familiar with each other, especially the fact that Leia was attuned to the Force. She showed signs of it, her incredibly high intuition and her ability to read people before they expressed their feelings as well. At this point, Luke and Leia were still unaware that they were siblings, but it wasn't a big deal considering the love interest that was formed between Leia and Han. Thankfully, it had been a year since the death of Darth Vader, and since Lando Calrissian joined the Rebel Alliance. With the heroes of the Alliance focused on the fight against the Empire, they were able to be as productive as the Rebels were during the takeover of Lothal. Hera and Titus noticed the similarities, but they didn't mention it. The only difference being that instead of Hera, Sabine, Zeb, Chopper, Kanan, and Ezra inside of the Ghost, it was Han, Chewie, Leia, R2-D2, Titus, and Luke inside of the Falcon. Most of the time, Luke and Titus didn't leave the planet of Earth. After Luke's little outburst on Cloud City, he wanted to work on ensuring that didn't happen again. Though Luke had an issue with the idea of visiting Grandmaster Yoda on Dagobah. Titus didn't want to force his student to go to Dagobah, so he didn't. However, it was something that he believed Luke should do, especially before Grandmaster Yoda passed away, being that he was as old as he was. For Luke, it was hard enough. Yoda or Ben should have said something to him about his lineage regarding Darth Vader, and they didn't. While Titus agreed, it would be in favor of the Jedi Order if Luke put his personal feelings aside and did something that might be uncomfortable. The lesson Titus had for a student was that when one is uncomfortable, they grow the most. Titus believed that Luke would likely grow significantly from a short encounter with Yoda or Ben. Luke agreed, but this time he would go by himself. He didn't believe that Titus needed to be there with him to make sure he didn't do or say anything rambunctious. Titus trusted his student and Luke left. While Luke was using his personal X-Wing alongside R2 to get to Dagobah, the rebels were united inside of the command center. Currently, former Imperial Senator Mon Mothma was telling rebel generals and leaders about a discovery. Among them was Admiral Akbar, Generals Calrissian, Syndulla, Organa, Solo, and Titus, and in terms of space combat, Wedge was present, and so was Captain Holdo. The Alliance was awaiting the return of a message from Bothan spies who were currently infiltrating a classified location to retrieve information. Mothma informed the Alliance that once these plans were in their hands, it would be the final stand against the Empire. At the moment, the Shadow Fleet for the Alliance was gathered outside of Sullust. The Empire likely would know about their location of the fleet, being that Sullust was controlled by the Empire for a period of time before. Though the Shadow Fleet wasn't much of anything, just a couple of support ships and a singular Mon Calamari cruiser. The fleet wasn't much larger than the one that attacked Scarif 4 years beforehand, and that was the point. The rebels had been using their hit-and-run tactics for the last couple years, and in doing so, without encouraging a large fleet combat, using capital ships and such, they were able to dissuade the Empire from believing they had a large fleet. When the briefing was done, Titus picked up little Jacen Syndulla and walked over with him towards the ghost. He set the child down on top of Chopper. The droid buzzed and buzzed as he drove away. Chopper showed hostility to everyone except for Hera and Jacen. When Titus put the kid down, his mother came over and asked how Titus was hanging in. She had just returned from a mission off-world, and she was frequently leaving Jacen in Titus's care. There were a couple reasons for this. Firstly, Jacen was Force sensitive as a 4-year-old, and he was showing signs of being able to use the Force like his father. Secondly, Hera didn't want Jacen in any danger, and so she figured she'd leave him with her bestie. Thirdly, Titus was the most trustworthy person to leave her son with that wasn't Chopper. Titus didn't really mind, and neither did Luke, especially because Titus had to take care of Jacen and Luke at the same period of time. It helped Titus realize the importance and the role that Grandmaster Yoda once held. When his bestie came up to him, he told her that everything was alright, yet something did feel off. Hera asked what it was, and Titus told her that the end of the era was coming, though which era he was unsure. He couldn't tell if it was the end of the Jedi or the Alliance, maybe the Empire, but that didn't seem yet possible. Hera asked Titus if he had been meditating on it, to which Titus told her he wasn't really sure. He had, but he hadn't. It was more than anything a reoccurring nightmare. It was more than just a thought, but something he could visually see. It felt like something he could physically feel as well. Titus admitted that he didn't talk to Luke about it. It wasn't a trust thing or a lying thing. He was just keeping it from Luke because he wasn't entirely sure if it was the Force trying to communicate to him or if it was something else. Hera understood why he wasn't telling Luke, and she believed it was the right decision, mostly because if Titus wasn't sure of the dream being a communication or just a dream, then there was no need to worry or stress Luke out about it. It was the typical burden that someone in Titus's position would have to undertake, similar to what Hera had to do throughout her leadership during the early war. Titus pushed past his little dilemma, asking his bestie what was going on in her world. Hera admitted it was getting more difficult. It was harder before it got easier, and she knew that. However, the Empire was cracking down more on more worlds. Some planets and populations saw this as a good reason to fight back, while others saw it as a good reason to stay loyal to the Empire. Because if you were loyal, you didn't get destroyed by the overwhelming strength of the Empire. Hera told Titus of a few missions where a number of Y-Wings escorted by the Ghost and some B-Wings were able to obliterate an Imperial Star Destroyer. She mentioned how it was like the final days of the Fall. They felt isolated, but in reality the rebellion was growing. They were strong and they were everywhere. Hera and Titus continued their conversation for an elongated period of time. Titus would tell her about the progress her son made in the Force training, and Hera would tell vast stories of her adventures. When the time came, Mon Mothma assembled the rebel forces for a meeting. When she did, it was around the same time that Luke was returning to Earth. At this point, he learned that he was one of 2 Skywalkers, the other one being his twin sister, Leia. In all honesty, it made perfect sense, especially considering she was beginning her training, to a lesser degree of course. When Luke returned, he was able to get into the command center in due time for the meeting. Mon Mothma would reveal that the Bothan spies were able to gather information regarding the Emperor's secret project over the Endor system. It was a second Death Star, and it would be housing the Emperor during a period of time, as he was overseeing its construction. The Alliance believed they could take advantage of this by destroying the Death Star and killing the Emperor. The rebels had 2 Landa shuttles, though they would only be using one of those for this mission. Titus looked at Mothma and then listened as she stepped back, allowing Admiral Ackbar to come forward and speak. He laid out a plan for the rebels to follow. On the ground, the rebels needed a volunteer strike team to take down the shield generator that was guarding the Death Star. General Solo volunteered. Joining him would be Leia, Chewie, and Captain Rex. Ackbar continued telling the group that General Calrissian and Syndulla would assist the space assault, leading 2 separate groups of fighters. Titus looked across the room as Luke Skywalker entered. They nodded at each other. When the briefing was over, Titus walked over to Luke. Young Skywalker seemed a little jaded, though by what he wasn't sure. Luke asked what his master wanted to talk about. Titus explained that they could do something rather risky if they wanted. He asked what, to which Titus explained that they could go and use the other Landa shuttle to try and get aboard the Death Star to make sure that the Emperor was appropriately dealt with. They would have to wait for a little while because they weren't entirely sure if the Emperor was there yet. He was set to enter the station after the ground assault team landed on the surface, but without a spy on the station, no one could really tell. It would be the safest option to do it in this way anyways. This was a little out there for Luke. Aside from the time he saved his sister, he hadn't ever really worn Imperial armor. Titus, on the other hand, having been a member of the Ghost crew, was more than a functional individual inside of Imperial armor. The Landa shuttle was equipped with Imperial armor, so they would have no issue sneaking onto the facility as long as the clearance codes were still functional. Luke was prepared for this. He and his master would face the Emperor, the single-handedly most evil being the galaxy had ever seen. With crews established for the mission, the rebels began to split up. Lando Calrissian would take command of the Millennium Falcon, while Han, Leia, Chewie, and Rex would depart for the forest moon of Endor. This entire assault at Endor was meant to draw not just the rebels in, but the Jedi in, so that Palpatine could complete his victory. Not to mention, he already felt Yoda's death through the Force, so he was more than aware that his rival in the Force was gone. Surely the only individual that could challenge him was Skywalker's son, but being that Palpatine survived both fights with Windu and Yoda, a boy didn't scare him. Regardless, after wishing the Force to be with his friends, Luke joined his master. The two of them were going to meditate, to concentrate on the Force and come together in synchronization. Luke and Titus went to the rock formation, which was situated near the rebel base, and they went in as master and apprentice. Both of them knelt down in the middle, sitting across from each other and facing each other. Titus said to close their eyes and focus on the living Force. They'd be guided by the Jedi from the past. The mission to fight the Emperor would be one that they could only complete together. Even with the destruction of the Death Star, the Emperor was elusive. He'd survived encounters with several assassins and always figured out a way to escape any predicament. Palpatine would be their biggest challenge, but if they could destroy him, the Alliance could defeat the Death Star, then surely they could win the war. After 12 hours, Titus would give his good friend Hera a hug goodbye, and hug little Jason, telling him that he would be back so that they could finish his training. Hera told Titus and Luke that if they needed evacuation, she could be ready for them. They thanked her and departed inside of a secondary Imperial shuttle that was waiting for them, and they would jump to hyperspace. Inside the shuttle, during the hyperspace jump, they would talk to each other. After all, it was just Luke and Titus on this mission. They needed to get everything off their chests. Their meditation was incredibly necessary for this mission. It emptied their hearts and their souls from anything that could hold them back. The stone structure was a haven of energy. Titus spent the last 20 years of his life trying to figure out and understand what it was, but there was nothing to understand. The ancient Jedi built it so that they could utilize the most prominent position of the Force energy on the planet. It could communicate to others across the galaxy, but it could also be used to harvest energy for yourself. Mount Etna's temple was much more of a sanctuary full of history, whereas a stone structure called Stonehenge, which Titus and Luke called the Stone Temple, it was a portal for energy. Titus learned that it was the Stone Temple which helped him defeat his sister when she arrived. Luna almost had him beat, and he emerged victorious because of his aid from the Stone Temple. Of course, it's not the sole reason he won, but it contributed heavily to his victory. Luke and Titus, having had their hearts and their souls cleared from any sort of darkness, had talked to each other. Their minds were traps, and they had all the thoughts raging from positive to negative. They needed to clear the negative space before going to the Emperor's throne room, so they started talking. Luke went first. Having been the one to say goodbye to Yoda, he had a lot on his chest. He admitted his resentment for the Grand Master withholding information from him. Titus asked what to which his student told him that Leia was his twin sister, and then he told Luke to be wary of the Emperor's power, considering it was the Emperor who turned Anakin against the Jedi. It was a solid warning, and it needed to be known so that Luke could adequately prepare for his fight against the Emperor. Once Luke fleshed out his feelings, Titus expressed his stresses of being a master. Not that Luke or Jason were a burden, but being the last of his kind was unnerving. Titus was one of the last remaining Jedi Masters in the galaxy, and with the former Grand Master becoming one with the Force, it likely meant that Titus was technically the Grand Master of the Order. That is, unless Quinlan Vos was still alive elsewhere in the galaxy. However, he'd be in his late 60s or early 70s or whatnot by this point, which could be very unlikely. Titus told Luke that there was a pressure that Masters never talked about, but Luke understood. The ability for Luke and Titus to be vulnerable with each other is what made them a strong pair of Jedi Master and Jedi Knight, being that Yoda referred to Luke as a Jedi Knight. When they arrived at Endor, Titus remembered the first time he saw the Death Star, the absolute shock on his face, and the terror he felt in his being. They both knew what they had to do. There was no going back from here. They had to get permission to land from the Executor Super Star Destroyer. It took a hot minute, but they were granted permission to land. At the moment, it was a nightmare on the planet of Endor. The rebels had made friendship with the Ewoks. There were a couple hours till morning, which meant a couple hours before the Alliance would attack. At the moment, it was nighttime on the planet of Endor. The rebels had made friendship with the Ewoks. There were a couple hours till morning, which meant a couple hours before the Alliance would attack. Their shuttle landed inside the Death Star, and when the doors opened, two stormtroopers walked out of the shuttle, both of them carrying bags over their shoulders. Inside those bags were their lightsabers. The Jedi were in, and they went off a communication, turning off all contact with anyone a part of the Alliance. The Death Star was much larger than its predecessor, so this would be an absolute maze to navigate, especially without knowing where Sidious could be. Obviously, he had a throne room, which would be somewhere on the exterior of the superstructure. The two Jedi carried on walking past large groups of stormtroopers, taking elevators to restricted floors and so on. The two of them came across 4 royal guards and followed them. These guards would be on the pathway to the Emperor's throne room. It would have been better if they hadn't spent 3 or 4 hours wandering around the structure, At this point, the rebels on the ground had made their move on the shield generator. Regardless, when the royal guards got to the elevator, they waited and got in. They used their Imperial cylinders to get them up to Palpatine's throne room. Before the door could close, Luke and Titus rounded the corner, using the Force to throw them in the walls, knocking them out. The two Jedi jumped into the elevator, removing their armor and revealing their Jedi robes. When the doors opened, the Jedi stepped out, holding their lightsabers in their hands. The royal guard present in the throne room jumped to the attack. Without igniting their weapons, the Jedi used the Force to throw the guards into the massive reactor shafts nearby. When the guards were disposed of, they crept up the stairs to see the back of the throne. The throne didn't move, but an eerie voice slid around the corner of the chair. Luke and Titus stopped, gripping their blades in their hands without igniting them. The voice told the Jedi that they made a terrible mistake by trying to threaten him on the eve of his final victory over the Alliance. The chair turned, and they looked at the decrepit Emperor Palpatine. It was odd, considering all public appearances of the Emperor were shown with healed skin and perfectly curated silver hair. The Jedi ignited their weapons, to which Sidious did nothing but smile, telling the Jedi that their weapons would not be enough to save them. If they truly believed they could stop him, then they would have to watch their friends die. The two Jedi were lifted from the air as a group of royal guards with their staves came in. They pinned the two Jedi to the ground, as Palpatine used the Force to turn their attention towards the window. The Alliance fleet had just arrived out of hyperspace. Palpatine grinned, allowing the rebels to fall into his trap. On the surface, the rebels had captured the base, but it was recaptured by the Empire. The elite Imperial troopers were more than a match for the rebels on the ground, and so they were dealt with accordingly. The rebel fleet broke off into several groups, and when the fleet dispersed, the Death Star, per the request of the Emperor, opened fire on the rebel forces. They were completely caught off guard by this move made by the Empire. Akbar almost called for a total retreat, but Calrissian suggested that the rebels get closer to the Imperial Star Destroyers in hopes that the Death Star would misfire and hit one of the destroyers instead of the capital ships. Inside of the Emperor's throne room, Luke and Titus nodded at each other. Titus turned his head and gripped a control panel and swung it backwards. The circular panel slid across the floor and wiped out the guards, releasing the Jedi from their grip. Luke ignited his lightsaber and stood up. Sidious had no fear of this, as he looked at young Skywalker with his fiery Jedi blade, and then turned his attention to Titus, who got up behind Luke and ignited his own lightsaber. Sidious was super amused. He got up from his feet and called the Jedi fools. He was a genius though, and taking Titus away from Skywalker would help him accomplish this task. Being as powerful and as wise as he was, he surely could destroy the two of them, but he wanted himself a new student. Titus raised his blade and Luke did too. The two of them moved forwards. The Emperor smiled. Using the Force, Sidious lifted Titus off the ground and slammed him into the ground, throwing his lightsaber from his hand, throwing Titus across the room into Luke and knocking him down. Sidious told Luke to use his anger. The Dark Lord stepped forward and raised both of his hands and shot lightning at Titus, electrocuting the Jedi Master. His bones shaking and his skin trembling under the immense heat of the dark side of the Force. Sidious grinned, shooting more and more electricity at the Jedi Master. Titus cried out, telling Luke not to give in to the dark side. Skywalker stood up and ignited his lightsaber again. The lightning stopped. Titus groaned in agony as smoke rose above his burning flesh. He looked over at Luke, trying to speak, but he couldn't. Sidious turned his attention to Luke, smiling as he did. He told Luke to kill his master, and if he did, he would have a chance to rule by his side. Luke looked over at Titus laying on the ground, helpless in this moment. Luke could very easily ally himself with the forces of the dark side, but he raised his lightsaber, to which Sidious' scowl presented itself. He raised his hands at the Jedi Knight and fired lightning at him. Luke blocked the lightning with all of his strength, but Sidious knew he would break through. He just needed to press forward with more strength. Luke stumbled. The lightning began creeping over the edge of the lightsaber. Young Skywalker had so much strength, but as Sidious spoke, he had not enough power to match him. The dark side was more powerful than light could ever be. Luke closed his eyes. In silence, he heard nothing and saw nothing. He felt no tension, and he felt no pull to the dark side. Luke heard his name called out. He looked over. Using the Force to pull Titus' lightsaber into his hands, he grabbed the lightsaber, igniting it, and holding it as an X in front of him. Sidious looked at him with shock, and before he could stop himself, Luke used the Force and all of his strength to fire it back at Palpatine, ripping his age-old skin apart. Sidious' body began to split, with flesh being ripped from bone. Around the galaxy, shaking began. Sidious was the last Sith. All of the Sith were one with him. As his body began to deteriorate with the power of the Force, the Sith themselves began to crumble. Sidious wasn't able to essence transfer out of this. When his body deteriorated into nothingness, Sith temples across the galaxy exploded. The temples on Exegol, Morabon, Creuss II, Coruscant, and everywhere. else in the galaxy exploded. The Sith Eternal who called Exegol home perished and their cloning facilities were destroyed in the absence of Palpatine. The Force itself was extinguishing the Sith with the death of Palpatine. Never in their history had they been totally destroyed, and now they were gone. Luke fell to his knees and looked over at the robes of Sidious, left in ruins. Titus tried to get up, but his raw flesh was burned so badly. He leaned himself back against the railing he was next to and called out to Luke, asking if he was alright. Luke turned his head over and looked at his master. He got up and made his way over to him to make sure he was alright. Titus told Luke he was alright, but they needed to get off the Death Star. On the ground of Endor, Han Solo, Leia, and Chewie were able to get access to the shield generator and put charges in it to blow it up. With the shield generator down, Lando led a group of X-Wings, A-Wings, and Y-Wings into the Death Star itself. Hera and the rest of the fighters were holding off the Imperials while the rebels escaped the fleet battle. Inside the Death Star, Luke helped Titus to a shuttle where they departed. The Superstructor's reactor within minutes would be bombed by Lando and Wedge. As they escaped, the Death Star blew up behind them, reducing several of the Imperial Star Destroyers in the air in the fleet to ash, while the few remaining Star Destroyers retreated into the dark abyss of space. The Emperor was dead, the Sith were gone, and the second Death Star was destroyed. The rebels would regroup on the surface of Endor for an amazing celebration. Titus and Luke would reunite with Lando, Han, Leia, Chewie, and Hera. Their celebration would be shared galaxy-wide. With the victory at Endor, the rebellion would grow massively in a short period of time, and within the span of a year, the Empire would be overthrown. Coruscant would fall and the New Republic would rise. During that year and that long period of time, the heroes of the Battle of Endor would continue their fight together. The only one difference being the newlyweds that married on Endor, being Han and Leia. Coincidentally, the same day the Galactic Civil War came to an end was the same day that their son Ben Solo was born. Regardless of him, the rebellion made quick moves to strike at the core, and after Jakku fell, the Empire was destined to fall afterwards. Though there were rumors circulating that the Empire wasn't truly dead, and there were several remnants of the evil Empire still around. There were also sightings of an ever-elusive Ahsoka Tano. She had returned from the dead seemingly, but she was sighted by Sabine, who called Lothal home for the past 5 years. She stayed waiting for an Imperial attack that never came. Now she and Ahsoka were off to look for Ezra Bridger. He was still alive, but that meant that Grand Admiral Thrawn was also still alive. Though away from the possibilities of the dead returning, the Jedi returned to Earth to restart a new order. After the Galactic Civil War was won, Titus and Luke returned to rebuild the Fallen Order. As far as they were aware, they were the last 2 Jedi still alive in the galaxy, but Earth was already such a thriving planet for them to start their order on. While they could have had their first student with Jacen Syndulla, Hera wasn't exactly for the idea of it, which was one of the multitude of conversations that Titus and Hera had over the years. Titus trained Jacen so that he could be aware of the potential he had, but if he ever wanted to learn more, then surely he could, but the point wasn't to take him away from his mother. Titus and Luke began constructing an academy here on Earth. Their choices were Tython and Ossus, but decided Earth because of its relatively neutral history in the ways of Jedi-Sith confrontation. Ossus wasn't as strongly connected to the Force as Earth, and Tython had been ransacked by the Sith, and their energy left a stain. Luke and Titus wanted all their students to be free from the burdens of the dark side and the past. Their Jedi Academy would have a resemble of that of the look of the Jedi Islands on Ahch-To, which neither Jedi had been to at this point. After the Academy was constructed, Titus and Luke split up, going off into the galaxy searching for relics of the Jedi Order. There was still a rebel base on Earth, so the Jedi Temple would be taken care of. The locals on the planet were still not nearly as advanced enough to begin to intermingle in the galactic society, aside from those freed from slavery. For the most part, after the tragedy during the Clone Wars, the people of Earth had regressed. It had been more than 20 years, but all civilization was reduced to rubble, leaving less than 100,000 people left on the planet. It was a lot of people, just not a lot for an entire planet. The rebels' whole goal was to ensure they didn't disrupt the rebuilding process for the people of Earth. While the generations of the people of Earth were slaughtered by slavers decades before, there was new growth. Interactions between the Jedi or the Alliance with the locals were inherently negative. At the current base, the people in the local area didn't typically interact with the Alliance, but if they came in contact, it became very hostile within moments. The pockets of civilization away from them could very easily be distinguished. There were signs of cultural growth, but it was best left alone. Every time the Alliance tried to get involved, people were killed, and for the most part, it was members of the Alliance trying to bring offerings of peace that were killed. Titus's few interactions with his own people weren't positive either. Using the Force wasn't taken positively, and neither was he, even though he looked like them. In a means to create peace and hope for future positivity for the people, the Alliance under Titus's guidance would do supply drops for the people of Earth. These supply drops would give people new technologies that could help advance civilization. Typically, these would be more advanced machinery for agriculture, water systems, or medicine. The drops went down to these civilizations at night. While the people were innovative, these technologies would at the very least bring them back to where they were before the Zagarians came. Though a people so close to the brink of extinction and generational trauma needed time, it'd be the best thing for them. Time would tell how this fresh start would go. There was a reason for the Rebel, which was technically now a New Republic base, to be here on the planet. Considering the location, a Republic base here would be the quickest way to intercept pirates flying around the area. If they could intercept these pirates, they could stop them from rising. Hondo Ohnaka was no longer a contributor to that chaos, but he did call Earth home. As the mind of a pirate, he was able to readily help the New Republic with any issues around pirates, and he got a great price for it, and he got the luxury of amnesty provided by the New Republic. Zeb Orrelios stayed on base, but he got off as frequently as he could because he didn't want to interact with Hondo for too long. The reason the New Republic was so worried about pirates is because a year before the death of Vader on Bespin, the Crimson Dawn returned, and the rebels had to deal with it. Notably, Leia and Holdo dealt with Kira, who resurrected the organization after the Empire obliterated it and banished them all to the planet of Malachor, essentially. Zeb was also happy to help out considering he was good friends with Titus. They just hadn't seen each other since before the Battle of Scarif. The galaxy was rapidly changing, and the Jedi were trying to play catch-up, as Mon Mothma and the New Republic began to demilitarize, though Leia would have to see herself out of the inner circles of the New Republic politics when it was revealed that her father was Darth Vader himself. It was alright for her because she had a son and a husband and they lived on Trongilia basically for free, thanks to their efforts to thwart the Empire. The two Jedi found themselves at different places. Titus was on the planet of Ilum. He was very familiar with the planet, but he was visiting to see if he could find anything of the past that might be worth bringing forward, while Luke, on the other hand, was inside of the makeshift archives left behind by Jedi archivist Jocasta Nu. The information here housed was very invaluable to the rebuilding of the Jedi Order. After all, ANT droids built Luke and Titus an incredible academy, and it just needed information to have within it, so that the two Jedi could truly train the next generation. The largest advantage to this Jedi Order was Titus. He was from an era of the former Jedi Order, which meant he had the experience with the help of a failed Jedi Order. Titus knew what worked and what didn't from his own interpretation of the Jedi, but for the most part, they would follow closely to what was established by the Jedi at their roots. There was a reason for this, and it was because it was only 500 years before the fall of the Jedi when the Jedi were at their best. It wasn't the lack of emotion or the lack of attachments that made the Jedi weak, it was their loyalty to a corrupt republic. It was two established powers collapsing at the same time. Titus recognized that and perceived it as such. He had several sessions with Jedi Master Kelleran Beck, who donned the robes of the High Republic. His family had a lineage inside the Jedi Order, and he spoke fondly of stories passed down from uncles, aunts, cousins, and such. When Titus and Luke were together, Titus told him these stories. The two of them agreed on restarting the Jedi Order in relationship to some of the older texts written about the Jedi, which were found by Luke. When the two of them transcribed the ancient language, they returned to Mount Etna and began deciphering the story written. There were stories about the rise and fall of the Jedi, but there were more so prophecies just of how the Force worked, that some would rise and others would fall. The light would rise and so would the darkness. The light would also have to diminish said darkness to carry out the balance meant to exist within the Force. The two Jedi took that to heart and began their academy, which would see a young Force-sensitive being, the same species as Yoda, join their ranks. Though after 2 years of training young Grogu, the two Jedi would elect to do something the preceding Jedi Order would have never done: give Grogu a choice. Titus and Luke gave Grogu the choice to leave if he wanted. They both knew that if they held Grogu here against his will, then he would become resentful, but if Grogu chose to stay with the Order, then he was making a sacrifice himself to choose being a Jedi over the life of being a Mandalorian. Both Jedi knew what would become of Grogu at a certain point. Eventually, he would live past his Mandalorian friend, and he would again be faced with the choice of joining the Jedi Order, or doing whatever else he might be enticed to do at that time in his life. The Jedi wouldn't see a new student until the year 15 ABY, when Luke's nephew, Ben Solo, would join the Jedi Order. For the first 6 years leading up to Ben's joining of the Jedi Order, Luke and Titus outfitted their temple with artifacts and information regarding the past of the Jedi. The two of them practiced their skills and their mastery, both of them heeding the words told to Luke at Yoda's death, the words being passed on, what you have learned. The Jedi tried to embody that, but there was so much more to that statement than the two of them originally realized. Luke and Titus would welcome a class of nearly 20 students when Ben became one of them. The lessons involved around everything that Luke and Titus had been taught. The evolution of the Jedi began, and with a New Republic base nearby, Titus and Luke would keep tabs on all that was going on with the New Republic and the war against the Imperial remnants. In 21 ABY, Grand Admiral Thrawn would be reported as destroyed at the Second Battle of Atalon, the same place where Thrawn curb-stomped the rebels at Chopper Base. With Thrawn's defeat, the remnant would disappear from the spotlight in the Outer Rim, many people assuming that they had gone into extinction. It would be true. Without an emperor to serve, the remnants would tear each other apart. Brendel Hux, the father of Armitage Hux, would be the last hope for the galaxy and the Empire, as he began the construction of a First Order, but it would be crippled by the strength of other Imperial factions. These factions being exposed by pirates for ransom, and the New Republic would finalize their destruction. For years, nothing would harm the balance of the galaxy. That is until the Jedi had a small bit of tension arise in the year 28 ABY. The Jedi Academy had been going brilliantly for the longer part of 13 years. Ben was the oldest member of the Jedi Order. He was currently 23 years old, and he was the spitting image of its grandfather, and that was an issue. While the Sith were gone, and the only clone of Palpatine was a non-Force sensitive male named Dathan, Ben had a darkness. It was common within his bloodline. All the Skywalkers had it. Anakin, Luke, Leia, and now Ben. He, similarly to Anakin, showed it during his training. Titus was well aware of this, mostly because Anakin almost wounded him during a sparring session when they were adolescents. Though Titus believed that he should let Ben work through it. Titus currently was a Grand Master of the Jedi Order, being that he was 72 and the oldest member in the Order. He talked with Ben about it from time to time, but he continuously admitted that he was fine and that there was nothing wrong with it. The real issue for Ben wasn't the Sith, but his obsession with Darth Vader. Ben thought Darth Vader was incredible, and when you mix the cockiness of Han Solo and the hard-headedness of Leia, the blood of Anakin, you get yourself an absolute nightmare of a Jedi. Of course, most of these attributes weren't actually bad, but mixed with an obsession with the Emperor's enforcer, it didn't bode well for his path as a Jedi. One night, Luke and Titus talked about it. One of the other Jedi in the Academy, named Ty, confronted the Jedi Grand Master about Ben's issues with anger. Titus informed Ty that he would confront the issue. Luke decided that he would confront the young Skywalker, and so he did, going to his hut in his sleep. When he got there, he used the Force to peer into Ben's mind. In a singular instant, he saw everything he feared coming to reality. He saw the destruction of planets, the burning of civilizations, the death of all of his friends, and the death of the Jedi. And for a singular moment, Luke reacted, grabbing his lightsaber and igniting it. All in that moment, he realized his mistake. Luke wouldn't have ever harmed his nephew. Fear of the future pushed him here. The tests of a true Jedi never cease, and Luke instantaneously felt terrible for it. Ben woke up to the sound of the lightsaber and turned his head. The way Ben saw it, Luke was coming to kill him, but that was far from the truth. Luke watched the lightsaber flip into Ben's hand, and Luke moved to defend himself, blocking a strike from his student, and then the roof caved in on him. Ben escaped the hut, feeling his immense pressure to go forward. He studied everything he could about his grandfather. He'd become what Vader could not, would he? He didn't feel so sure about that. Ben was blinded by anger and frustration, but when he exited the ruins of the hut, he saw the Grand Master. Titus had a weight of disappointment on his face. He simply looked at his greatest student with sadness. He could feel the conflict within Ben. It wasn't something Luke felt because there was true darkness inside of Ben's head, but now that he was awake after using his reflexes to bring down the roof on Skywalker, he felt conflicted about the idea of killing his peers. Aside from the draw to be like his grandfather, there was no individual communicating with him, trying to drag him down to the depths of the Force. Ben held his lightsaber in his hand and ignited the weapon. Titus knew what he had to do. He looked at the grandson of Anakin Skywalker and didn't move, not touching his blade and waiting for Ben to make his move. Ben did. He swung forward. Titus spun around, ducking under Ben and making the student miss. Ben Solo may have been talented, but he wasn't nearly as skilled as a Grand Master. Titus looked at Ben and steadied his footing. As an older man, it was difficult to keep pace. Ben turned back and around and put his lightsaber backwards and took 3 steps, swinging up and down, swinging left and right, but each missing. The few students who were watching stopped watching and ran over to help Master Skywalker from the rubble. Titus kept his distance from Ben, waiting to make his move. He understood that the Jedi Grand Master had to do what no one else could do. Luke emerged from the rubble seeing Ben fighting with Titus. The Jedi Master evaded each strike, and then when Titus saw Luke emerge, he looked at him, in the same way Ben Kenobi did. Luke saw this look in his eyes. Ben ran forward and jabbed his blade straight through Titus' stomach. Titus closed his eyes and grabbed Ben's shoulders. Solo panicked. He fell backwards and looked at the Grand Master. The students and Master Skywalker all gasped. Titus fell to his knees and looked at Ben. Young Solo got up to his feet and in an instant, realizing what he had done. Without the confrontation, without the need to win a duel, he realized all too late. To Titus, it wasn't about winning. He was proving a point. He was showing Ben that there was no conflict that needed to be. Ben grabbed a hold of Titus and apologized profusely, but Titus silenced him, telling him that it was his choice. It was his sacrifice to the Jedi, to show them all that the path of darkness would only bring regret. Titus knew Ben wasn't committed to the dark side, but if he killed everyone in the temple after showing them he was the best, then he would feel gratification. He didn't get that here. Titus showed him up without using a lightsaber, and when Ben looked like he lost, when he was about to face his crimes for trapping Luke under the rubble, he won. All the terrible events that he could have been responsible for vanished from his mind. The obsession with Vader disappeared, and he felt true loss. Titus' sacrifice wasn't in vain, and he knew that. He fell into Ben's arms as Luke came running up to him. Titus looked at him and told him that they were the future of the Jedi. It was time to let go of the darkness that resided. It was time for the Jedi to return. Titus looked into Ben's mind. The death of Han and Leia were gone. The destruction of planets and the burning of civilization dissipated. Titus turned his attention to his longtime student and told them that the Jedi now belonged to him. If they ever needed guidance, all they would have to do is look into the Force. Titus looked up, and all the students gathered around him, looking down. Titus spoke up under his dying breath and told them to pass on what they've learned. As Titus' last breath left his lungs, his body slowly disappeared. His cloth fell to the ground. His death happened on the same field he killed his sister on, and on the same field he lost his first student on. Titus became one with the Force, and Ben looked at Luke, but before Ben could say a word, Luke apologized. He told Ben that he wouldn't have ever killed him, and he never ever thought about doing so in the moment. It was just a reactionary thought. Ben looked down at the robes of Titus and nodded his head. He knew and he understood. The sacrifice Titus made wasn't meant to put him into martyrdom. Rather, his sacrifice was meant to show the Jedi what these dark thoughts could do to them. What these thoughts could bring them. Titus knew that when Luke went, he wasn't going to kill his nephew. He knew exactly how these events would play out. The death of Titus was meant to represent that sometimes the Jedi mess up, because they are not legends, but living beings, capable of mistakes. But the purpose of the Jedi was to be more than that, to not just make those mistakes, but pass on what an individual learned from them. The Jedi would rise, their order would be small for centuries, but it would grow over time. Luke would help train two students that ended up having a rare connection to the Force. Rey, who was brought to the temple by Dathan years after the sacrifice of Titus, would form a bond with Ben. As a dyad, they'd become two of the strongest living beings in the galaxy, and they would pass on their lessons. Before Luke passed away, he'd welcome young Din Grogu into the Jedi Order. Ben and Rey would lead the new order until they were succeeded by Grogu, the new Grand Master, and the Jedi Order would flourish for centuries and even past that millennia. A new Jedi Order grown and located on the planet of Earth, with a regrowing population built for a new, self-sustaining galaxy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Season 2 of What If Earth Was in Star Wars. Special thanks to all of our patrons. All the names are listed right here. Special thanks to all of you for joining me on this epic conclusion to our story. I'm going to talk about it real quick. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed. So the story of this is much different than I originally had the other one. The other one and this were meant to be completely different, and that was the point. I didn't want to just do the same one or the same thing I did last time. That wouldn't be unique, and I wanted to tell a story here. Now, the point of these stories is to tell something humane, and the point of this story is the whole purpose of this series was to do something that I didn't do in the last story. The last season of Earth was all about broad pictures. There was a story there, but it was about a broad picture. This story was about individuals, the difference between the best of us and the worst of us. As you can tell, Luna represents the worst of us, Titus represents the best of us. Of course, the story is about two humans. It's not about my original characters. I don't care about the whole idea of putting a character that I made into the main story. That's not something I've ever really cared about. You see that with Daisha and Natabre and all the other characters I've ever made on this channel. This was all about having two people from Earth represent the best of us and the worst of us in each of these situations, to represent what we can become and what we can fall to if we allow certain attributes to overtake us, to allow trauma to define who we are. And that is especially seen with Luna. If we let trauma not define who we are, but allow trauma to redirect the choices that we make in our life, then you can see that with Titus. And that is the whole purpose of the story. The whole purpose of the story is for the individual watching the story. It's not more so the civilization that is Earth, but more so the individuality that makes each and every single one of us unique. And that's what I was going for. That was the whole purpose of this, was the whole concept of new characters into a story to tell about Earth and tell about us. And of course, for Earth itself, the mystery behind the great purpose of Earth in the story is that Earth is so much greater. We need to stop looking towards what we don't have. We need to focus on what we have here on Earth, right? Instead of looking towards the stars, look towards each other, because all of us are truly special. And so, as I wrap up this story, I want to say thank you all for watching. I don't have any intentions of doing a season 3 of this. I think I'm going to continue with the Sith Clone Wars and probably something new. But it's been fun doing 2 series and 2 different seasons of this with 2 different stories. I always try to challenge my writing skills, to challenge myself as a writer. And I believe that this story is probably the most complete story I've told, aside from What If Anakin Was Never Discovered. But I wanted this story to feel grounded. I wanted you to feel like you could be with these characters and grow with these characters and go through the entire lives of not just these characters, but the people that for them, right? So the first two characters you're introduced to, and then all the way up to Titus and Luna and their deaths and the passing and what their respective deaths mean for the story. And of course, as I mentioned, the greater purpose is Luna dying early is the significant difference between Titus dying old. She doesn't die in peace, she dies in anger, she dies in being upset, she dies in rage because she let her trauma define her. And Titus, who was able to overtake his trauma to supersede that, he was able to die in peace. He knew that he was going to die in that moment, and he let himself die because he came to peace, because he allowed his trauma to not define him, but grow, and let him grow as an individual. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I can't wait to do Season 2 of the Sith Clone Wars. Anyways, thank you all. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.